Perfect.
All right, everybody, what's going on? How y'all doing? And welcome to today's edition of SWAC Talk. This is the show we cover the SWAC inside and out. I'm your tour guide around the SWAC. C. Wells coming at you. And today we're gonna talk Alabama State Hornets. This is our second recap of each SWAC team. Last recap was Alabama A&M. So if you want to check that out, it'll be linked at the end of the video. You just hit that square and check it out. I'm also gonna have the link. I'm going to also have the link to the prediction that I have for Alabama State at the end of the video as well. So yeah, make sure y'all check that out. Also, link will be in the description. So like I said, we're going to talk Hornets in a minute, but before we do that, I don't have a set schedule for my recaps like I do with my previews. So just keep it locked into my socials. And I'm going to post the day before when each one drops. So you can get that. So make sure you check out the socials. Facebook is SWAC Talk, Instagram SWAC Talk, Twitter SWAC Talk 76. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to subscribe to the channel. Like the video, share it. Feel free to comment your thoughts on the Hornets season, and hit that join button to become a member, or hit that super thanks in the comment section, or you can donate to the Cash App $SWAC Talk. Anything would be appreciated. So let's go ahead and start this off talking about the Hornets. This team finished the season at 7-4, 5-3 in conference. My prediction was 5-6 and 3-5 in conference, so they obviously exceeded my expectations. My prediction was really based on the fact that I was scared of this offense. I did not really know how this offense would go, and so I kind of just played it super careful with my prediction because I just didn't know how the offense would do, and they didn't necessarily do great, but they did well enough to help to not lose games for that tremendous defense that they had. This defense was one of the top defenses in the conference, and they showed it week in and week out. Even with the offense not being where it should be, the defense was able to come out week in and week out and make things happen. So let's go ahead and look at the Hornets' schedule, and let's see how they got to this 7-4 mark. They opened up their season at home, beating Southern 14-10. They lost to Miles on their second game of the season, 21-17, in a game that really kind of had the season looking like it was gonna be in a tailspin. They made they made a quarterback change against FAMU and lost their game 23-10 on a late pick six. Scored 16-10 before that. Just like last season, they had a chance against FAMU late, blocked field goal, Rattlers returning for a touchdown. So 2 times in a row, this team had a chance against FAMU. A late Rattler scored, knocked them out the box. So they dropped their game 23-10, and they would lose their third game in a row against Alcorn 23-20 in overtime. And they were sitting at 1-3 and 0-2 in conference. Did not look good. Things looked pretty bleak. The offense, like I said, they weren't playing great. They kind of struggled, from time to time, and just did not look good. Defense was playing lights out as usual, but they got a homecoming victory over Bethune-Cookman 19-14, and then they would beat Jackson State 24-19 on the road. They would win the Magic City Classic 31-16. They would beat Grambling 17-6 and beat Valley 20-3 before they lost their last SWAC game, the Prairie View 21-14, and they won the Turkey Day Classic 41-3. So they were able to bounce back from that 3-game losing streak and win 4 in a row and find themselves in a good position going into their final conference game. They had a great opportunity to finish the season at 8-3, but ultimately they would finish at 7-4. 5-3 in conference. They were 3-2 at home, 2-2 on the road, and 2-2 in neutral sites. this team, like I said, they kind of just kind of found a way because they were not, they were not great on either side of the ball. Well, not on either side of the ball. They weren't great on offense, defense. They were tremendous, and they bailed themselves out. Special teams were great. They scored, quite a few special teams touchdowns or big plays in special teams to kind of get them back on track. Looking at some of the numbers from the 2022 season, this team scored 18.8 points per game. That was 11th in the league. They scored 20.1. They allowed 20.1 points per game, which was second. They were 11th in total offense at 307 yards per game. They were fifth in total defense at 325 per game. Oh, excuse me. They were 11th in rushing at 111 yards per game. They were fifth in rushing defense at 133 yards per game. They were sixth in passing offense at 195 yards per game. They were fifth in passing defense at 192 yards per game. They were eighth in sacks allowed at 30. They were sixth in sacks by their defense at 24. They were sixth in interceptions at 10. Third down percentage offense, they were sixth at 38%. Third down defense was also 38%. That was good for seventh place. They were last place in the conference in fourth down conversion rate at 16%, and they were second in fourth down defense at 30%. So switching over to this season, just kind of to see kind of how they improved at all, they jumped up to eighth in scoring offense at 20.6 points per game. They were second in scoring defense at 14.5 points per game. Total offense, they were ninth at 299 yards per game. So their offensive numbers went down a bit from last season. Total defense, they were second at 281 yards per game. Rushing offense, they ranked 11th at 111 yards per game. So that was basically even from last season. They were second in rushing defense at 100 yards per game. That was an improvement. Passing offense, they were seventh at 189 yards per game. Slight drop from last season. They were third in passing defense at 181 yards per game allowed. That was an improvement of about 11 yards. So the defense did much better against the run and the pass last season. They allowed 15 sacks on the season, which was a huge improvement from last year. The offensive line was a whole lot better this season, only allowing 15 sacks on the season. Defensively, they registered 25 sacks, which is sixth in the league, 1 sack improvement from last year. Interceptions, they had 11 this season, so they were up 1. That's good for sixth place. Also, they looking at the conversions on third down offense, they were third down offense. They were eighth at 32%, so that was down from 38. Third down defense, they were second at 30%. That was also down. So that third down defense got a lot better. The offense kind of regressed a little bit on third down. Fourth down offense, they were 11th at 36%. That was an improvement from last season. And they were last in fourth down defense. Opponents converted 68%, and that was a big difference from last season. Their last season was 30%. So they, the defense surprisingly got a lot better. You as good as their defense was last year, they were even better this year. That was one of my questions of this team coming into the season. I knew that their defense would carry this team, but I thought with losing some of the guys that they lost, that they would kind of take a slight step back, but they were a whole lot better than last season. They were a top 2 defense across the board. Offensively, the numbers weren't great, but they got production. They were able to score when the defense set them up in short fields. They just couldn't really drive the ball, and they didn't really score a lot of points, but they didn't need a lot of points. Juwan Howell was the leading rusher with 419 yards on 99 carries. He had 2 touchdowns, averaged 4.2 yards per carry. Marcus Harris got a lot of carries later in the season. He had 87 carries for 331 yards and 4 touchdowns. He averaged 3.8 yards per carry. Demetrius Davis, although he only played in 5 games, he finished third at 44 carries for 204 yards and no touchdowns, averaged 4.6 yards per carry. And the final ball carrier over 100 yards was Jalen Salton. He had 32 carries for 112 yards and a touchdown, averaged 3.5 yards per carry. Passing, Damon Stewart, He took over around the FAMU game. He finished the season 129 of 200, completing 64% of his passes for 1,655 yards, had 11 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. Davis finished 42 of 61, completing 68% of his passes, 413 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Keyshawn Johnson was the guy in the passing game. He finished with 61 catches for 829 yards and 7 touchdowns. That's by far outpacing anybody else in the offense. Their next receiver was Tyree Saunders, who came on late when Johnson actually went down with an injury. Saunders finished with 16 catches for 283 yards and 2 touchdowns. Isaiah Scott, 19 catches, 247 yards and 2 touchdowns. Juwan Howell, 13 catches, 143 yards, no touchdowns. And Asa Gregg finished with 7 catches for 114 yards and 2 touchdowns. So Johnson had 7 touchdowns on his own. The rest of the team, they combined for 8 touchdowns. So he outpaced everybody in every aspect. Teams knew the ball was coming to him, and they still couldn't stop it. He was rightfully an all SWAC, a first teamer, and a guy who was a game changer. He made plays regardless of what the coverage was, regardless of what the other defense was doing, regardless of what his offense was doing. He made the plays, and they locked in on him. And he, like I said, he by far had more catches, yards, touchdowns than anybody else, and that's extremely productive. Bubba Adams led the defense with 124 tackles. DeMarcus Cunningham had 82. After that, Adrian Maddox was at 41, and Kale Jackson at 37, Mikey Victor 36, Traquan Thomas 35, Amar Scarborough 34, James Burgess 32. Tackles for loss, Bubba finished with 17, Traquan Thomas 12 and a half, Cunningham 6.5, Ogletree 5. Ogletree came on later in the season. Lightfoot 5. Young Roll had 4. Smith Cobb had 4. Sacks. Thomas led the defense with 7. Adams 4. Cunningham, Ogletree, Lightfoot, Young Roll, Smith Cobb, and Maddox each had 2 sacks apiece. Jackson, Victor, Scarborough, and Burgess each had 2 interceptions apiece to lead the defense. Victor had 13 pass breakups on the season. Adams and Young Roll had 6 quarterback hurries. Scarborough had 2 forced fumbles to lead the defense. Maddox, Thomas, and Adams and Jackson each had 2 fumble recoveries. Excuse me. Scarborough had 2 fumble recoveries to lead the defense. Maddox, Thomas, Adams, and Jackson each had 2 forced fumbles to lead the defense. LaPierre had 2 blocks to lead the defense, 2 block kicks to lead the special teams. Kicking game was kind of a mixed bag. Harrison Tuck averaged 37 yards per punt. With a long of 61, he had 14 punts. Farrakhan 18 punts inside the 20, 350-plus yard punts. He had 7 touchbacks on the season. Jaden John was 6 of 12 on field goals with a long of 29. He was 6 of 7 from 20 to 29 yards, 0 of 2 from 30 to 39 yards, and 0 for 3 from 40-plus. Baylor Cannon was 1 for 3 on the season. He was 1 for 3 from 30 to 39 yards. He had a long of 34. And Stuart McCall was 0 for 1. He had a kick from 30 to 39 yards he missed. So the kicking game only converted 43% of their field goals on the season, 7 of 16 with a long of 34. But the kick coverage, they blocked 4 field goals this season, so they were very good in that aspect. John averaged 56 yards per kickoff return. 56 yards per kickoff with 17 touchbacks on the season and 1 kick out of bounds. The return game, Robert McMinn averaged 13.1 yards per punt return with 1 touchdown. His long was 54. McMinn also had a touchdown on a kickoff against Tuskegee, 89 yards. He averaged 29.9 yards per return, 205 yards on 7 returns. BJ West had 6 returns for 135 yards, averaged 22.5 yards. And Eric Horn had 6 returns for 119 yards. He averaged 19 yards per return with a longer 59. Keyshawn Johnson led the team with 8 touchdowns, giving him 48 points. Jaden John had 6 field goals, 15 extra points, giving him 33 points. Harris had 4 touchdowns, giving him 24 points. Burgess, Greg, Howell, McMinn, Saunders, and Scott, they each had 12 points on 2 touchdowns apiece. Looking at some of their game highs on the season, this team, Marcus Harris led the team with 18 carries on the season against Grambling. 80 yards was the season high for them on individually rushing, and Harris, that was Marcus Harris against Alcorn. Only, nobody had a multiple touchdown rushing game. They had There are 10 games where one guy had a touchdown, including Harris and Johnson. They each had touchdowns against Valley on the ground. Lee and Howell had touchdowns against Tuskegee. Sultan and Harris had touchdowns against Alcorn. So Stewart and Harris had touchdowns against Jackson State. The longest rush on the season was 46 yards by Harris against Alcorn. 41 pass attempts were the most on the season by Damon Stewart. 28 completions also was against Prairie View by Damon Stewart. 383 yards was the season high. That was by Stewart against Prairie View. 3 touchdown passes was the season high against Tuskegee by Damon Stewart. Longest pass was 76 yards against Prairie View by Stewart. Johnson had two games with 9 receptions each as season highs, one against Southern, one against Prairie View. 120 yards. Johnson and Saunders both crossed that mark. Johnson did against Valley, Saunders against Prairie View. Johnson had 2 games with 2 touchdowns apiece, one against Southern and one against Grambling. Saunders had a 2-touchdown game against Prairie View. Saunders had the longest reception of 76 yards against Prairie View. Jaden John made 2 field goals against Bethune-Cookman. His longest field goal of 34 yards by Baylor Cannon came against Grambling. They punted 7 times against Valley. Harrison Tuck had a 59-yard average against Tuskegee. His longest punt of 61 yards came against Alcorn. McMinn had the longest punt return of 54 yards against Tuskegee, and he also had the longest kickoff return of the season against Tuskegee as well for 89 yards. Bubba Adams had 17 tackles against Miles for a season high, and Traquan Thomas had 2 sacks in 2 games against Alcorn and Bethune-Cookman. Adams had 3.5 tackles for loss in 2 games, one against Jackson State, one against Valley, and then they didn't have anybody with a multiple interception game. Looking at some of the team highs, 257 yards was the high on the ground that came against Alcorn. 383 was the high through the air that came against Prairie View, and the 3 touchdowns on the ground were a season high against Tuskegee. 2 rushing touchdowns were the high against Alcorn. So look, like I said, this team, they improved. I think this team was a lot better than really probably a lot of us thought. Especially when you look at that middle of the season portion. They got a little dicey right there. You kind of got a little, you kind of look like they were gonna tail off, starting off 1-3 with a D2 loss, but they were able to win the next 4 games and find themselves with a chance to finish at 8-3. They dropped that game against Prairie View, but they still finished at 7-4, which was an improvement of 1 game from last season. So really a good season for Alabama State. I mean, there's no other way to put it. They finished 2nd place in the division. So they found, they had a really solid season. They made the changes that they needed to make offensively, and the defense never cracked. They never really even bent. They played solid all season, and the offense did just enough in most games to get them victories. So I think this was a great season for Alabama State. I think they kind of lost some guys before the season to the portal, but they did a good job of just making a way. It wasn't pretty, but they just made a way. And sometimes that's what it takes. You know what I mean? Sometimes you win pretty, but sometimes you don't. And it really doesn't matter as long as you win. And I think that was that was the positive. This team never really, never really got blown out in any of their losses. So, they kind of, they dropped a 3-point game, a 4-point game. They lost by 13 late to FAMU, and they lost by 7 to Prairie View. So they were in every game that they played. They didn't really blow anybody out either, per se, but they, other than Tuskegee, really, not many other games were blowouts, but they were in games and they found ways to win them. And that's the mark of a solid team. So that's going to do it for our Alabama State recap. Again, they finished 7-4, 5-3. I picked them to go 5-6 and 3-5. So I was wrong by 2 games on both aspects. And I'm glad to see them do well. So again, if you check out the screen that's going to come up right now, you're going to be able to take a look at my Alabama State season preview, and you'll also be able to take a look at my Alabama A&M season recap, which dropped earlier in the week. And you'll be able to subscribe because there's a subscribe button right there too. So I'd like to thank y'all for rocking with us. Don't forget, tomorrow is our Celebration Bowl preview. We'll also talk about the point spread, and we'll go over our HBCU top 10 after the championship game. So with that being said, I'm your tour guide around the SWAC, Sewell, signing out, and I'm going to catch y'all on the rebound. Peace.